The camera operator's hand was shaking, not from nerves, from the realization of what he was filming. Studio 50, September 1956. Ed Sullivan stood at center stage, about to introduce a performer he'd sworn would never appear on his show. Not because of talent, because of danger, because of what this person represented. Ed had built his career as the guardian of American decency, the man who decided what was safe for families to watch on Sunday nights, and now, live on CBS. He was about to introduce someone who violated every standard he'd spent 8 years defending. The decision had already been made. The performer was backstage, waiting, but Ed's hand, holding the cue card, was trembling, because he knew this wasn't just an introduction. This was a surrender he couldn't take back. If you understand that gatekeepers only exist until someone proves gates are unnecessary, subscribe now. This isn't about rock and roll. It's not about Elvis Presley or the 1950s or teenage rebellion. Those are the stories people tell when they don't want to talk about what actually happened. This is about what happens when a system built on control encounters something it can't control. When authority based on exclusion discovers that exclusion only works if alternatives don't exist. You think this story is about Elvis performing on Ed Sullivan's show. It's not. It's about the moment a gatekeeper opened the gate and discovered he couldn't close it again. That gates only work in one direction, and that direction isn't always the one the gatekeeper chooses. To understand what Ed Sullivan was feeling in September 1956, you need to understand what the Ed Sullivan Show actually represented. Not as entertainment, as infrastructure. The Ed Sullivan Show wasn't a variety program that happened to be popular. It was the mechanism through which America decided what was acceptable. Every Sunday at 8 p.m., 50 million Americans watched Ed Sullivan curate their culture. He didn't just present performers. He certified them, made them legitimate, safe for mainstream consumption. Performers appeared on Ed's show only after passing through filters. Talent scouts evaluated them. Network executives reviewed their material. Standards and practices examined every word, every gesture, every implication, and Ed himself made the final decision. The system worked because it was hermetically sealed. There was one path to American audiences, through Ed Sullivan. If you wanted to reach mainstream America, you needed Ed's approval. There was no bypass, no alternative route. The Ed Sullivan Show was the gate, and Ed was the gatekeeper. And gatekeepers, by definition, have absolute power over access, over legitimacy, over who gets seen and who remains invisible. That power had been absolute for 8 years, until it wasn't. What nobody understood in September 1956 was that Ed wasn't introducing Elvis Presley to America. He was acknowledging that America had already decided without him, and acknowledgment without control isn't authority, it's observation. The problem started in January 1956. Elvis Presley appeared on Stage Show, a smaller variety program hosted by Tommy and Jimmy Dorsey. Ed didn't pay attention. Stage Show was minor, barely registered. But then Elvis appeared on the Milton Berle Show in June, performed Hound Dog, with hip movements that made parents call their local TV stations in outrage. Newspapers ran editorials about moral decay. Church leaders called Elvis dangerous. And Ed Sullivan, reading all this, made a public statement. Elvis Presley will never appear on the Ed Sullivan Show. His performance style is vulgar and inappropriate for family television. The statement was meant to draw a line, to signal what Ed's show stood for. Decency, standards, protection of American values. But the statement did something else. It made Ed's position visible, and visible positions can be challenged. In July 1956, Elvis appeared on The Steve Allen Show. Steve, trying to contain Elvis's dangerous energy, made him wear a tuxedo and sing Hound Dog to an actual dog. The performance was neutered, humiliating, but the ratings were massive. The highest-rated show of the summer, higher than the Ed Sullivan Show that week. That's when Ed Sullivan's certainty began to crack, not because he'd changed his mind about Elvis, because the numbers made his moral position irrelevant. Steve Allen had gotten higher ratings, with the performer Ed had publicly rejected, which meant Ed's rejection wasn't protecting his audience, it was just keeping them away, and keeping audiences away is the opposite of a gatekeeper's function. Gatekeepers are supposed to control access, but if audiences can access what they want through other gates, the gatekeeper becomes optional. And optional authority isn't authority, it's preference, and preferences are negotiable. Ed's network executives came to him with the data, the ratings, the youth audience, the commercial implications. Elvis Presley was going to be huge, with or without Ed Sullivan. But if Ed got him first, if Ed could claim Elvis as an Ed Sullivan discovery, the show would dominate. Ed resisted. He'd made a public statement. He'd drawn a moral line. If he crossed it now, he'd look weak, hypocritical, controlled by ratings rather than principles. But his executives had an answer for that too. You're not crossing your line. You're demonstrating that Elvis can meet your standards, that your show can civilize him where others failed. The reframing was clever. Ed wouldn't be surrendering to Elvis. He'd be domesticating him, proving that the Ed Sullivan Show's standards were so powerful they could make even Elvis Presley acceptable. That's what Ed told himself as he authorized his staff to negotiate with Elvis's manager, Colonel Tom Parker. But deep down, Ed knew the truth. He wasn't taming Elvis. He was acknowledging that his gate had been bypassed, that audiences didn't need his permission to decide what they wanted to watch. And that realization, once acknowledged, couldn't be unacknowledged. The negotiation was brutal. Colonel Parker knew Ed needed Elvis more than Elvis needed Ed. The price, $50,000 for 3 appearances, an unprecedented amount, more than Ed had ever paid anyone. But the price wasn't just money. It was acknowledgment. By paying that much, Ed was admitting Elvis was worth it, that his initial rejection had been wrong, that the moral position he'd taken publicly had been overridden by commercial reality. The contract was signed in August 1956. Elvis would appear on the Ed Sullivan Show 3 times, September 9th, October 20th. Ed issued a statement to the press. "I'm pleased to welcome Elvis Presley to the Ed Sullivan Show. Our program has always showcased the best talent in America." The statement carefully avoided mentioning Ed's previous rejection, pretended it hadn't happened, but everyone remembered. The press ran stories comparing Ed's old statement to his new one. Ed Sullivan reverses position on Elvis. The framing was devastating. Not that Ed had successfully tamed Elvis, that Ed had been forced to change his mind by ratings, by audience demand, by the market. That's not authority. That's compliance. And when gatekeepers comply, they're not gatekeepers anymore. They're coordinators, facilitators, people who arrange access rather than control it. September 9th, the day of Elvis's first appearance. Ed was unusually nervous. His staff noticed. He kept checking and rechecking the performance schedule, making sure everything was planned, controlled. Ed had one absolute requirement for Elvis's performance. The cameras would only show him from the waist up. Elvis's hip movements, the thing that made him controversial, would not be broadcast. The containment strategy was simple. Let Elvis appear, let him perform, but control what audiences saw. Prove that the Ed Sullivan Show could present Elvis without his dangerous elements, that Ed's standards still mattered. But the containment strategy had a flaw. It assumed that Elvis's power came from his hips, that if you removed the offensive element, you'd remove the danger. But that wasn't where Elvis's power came from. It came from something cameras couldn't avoid: energy, sexuality. an implicit promise that rules were breakable. You could film Elvis from the waist up, but his face still showed what his hips were doing. His voice still carried the implication. The restraint made it worse, more tantalizing, like trying to hide something that everyone knew was there. Ed introduced Elvis with careful neutrality. "Ladies and gentlemen, Elvis Presley." No enthusiasm, no endorsement, just a name. Elvis walked onto Ed Sullivan's stage, and 54 million Americans watched, the largest television audience in history up to that point. Elvis performed "Don't Be Cruel," "Love Me Tender," "Ready Teddy." The cameras stayed above his waist. But it didn't matter, the girls in the studio audience screamed anyway. Not tentative teenage squealing, primal screaming. The kind that suggests the rules have stopped applying, that something wild has entered a controlled space and can't be contained. Ed stood in the wings, watching, and something became clear to him that hadn't been clear before. He hadn't domesticated Elvis. He'd given Elvis his largest audience ever, legitimized him by putting him on the most respected show on television. Ed had thought he was controlling Elvis by containing his performance. But containment isn't control, it's just framing. And framing doesn't change what's being framed. It just decides how it's presented. Elvis was still Elvis, still dangerous, still representative of everything Ed had built his career opposing. The only difference was that now Ed had endorsed him, put his show's credibility behind him, made him acceptable. After the performance, Ed did something unprecedented. He walked back on stage while Elvis was still standing there. The audience was still screaming. Ed put his hand on Elvis's shoulder, looked into the camera and said, "This is a real decent, fine boy. We've never had a pleasanter experience with a big name than we've had with you." The statement was meant to neutralize the danger, to tell America that Elvis, despite appearances, was safe, respectable, approved. But the statement did something else. It made Ed's approval irrelevant, because the audience had already decided. They'd been screaming before Ed said anything, would keep screaming after. Ed's endorsement didn't legitimize Elvis, it legitimized Elvis's existence outside Ed's system. The ratings for that episode were astronomical. 82.6% of all televisions in America. The highest-rated entertainment program ever broadcast. Ed had achieved something unprecedented, and in achieving it, he demonstrated that his gatekeeping function was obsolete. Because if 54 million people wanted to watch Elvis, they were going to watch Elvis. Ed's approval didn't make it happen. It just acknowledged what was already happening. And acknowledgment without agency isn't power, it's narration. Elvis appeared 2 more times on the Ed Sullivan Show. Each appearance drew massive ratings. Each time, Ed introduced him with slightly more warmth, slightly more acceptance. By the 3rd appearance, Ed wasn't certifying Elvis for America. He was hosting a star who'd already been certified by America itself. The relationship had inverted. Ed needed Elvis more than Elvis needed Ed, and everyone watching understood it. What happened after Elvis changed everything about how the Ed Sullivan Show operated. Before Elvis, performers came to Ed seeking legitimacy. After Elvis, performers came offering Ed access to their audience, to their cultural moment, to their inevitable success that was happening with or without him. The gate was still there, but it had stopped being mandatory, started being optional. One venue among many, and optional venues don't have gatekeepers. They have hosts, and hosts have influence, not control. The real evidence appeared gradually. After Elvis, Ed started booking rock and roll acts more regularly, not because he'd changed his mind about rock and roll, because the alternative was irrelevance. Other shows were booking these acts, getting younger audiences. If Ed maintained his standards, his show would age out. become obsolete. So Ed adapted, booked the Beatles, the Rolling Stones, the Doors, each time telling himself he was controlling the dangerous element, making it safe, but really just acknowledging that the dangerous element was succeeding without his permission, and choosing to participate in that success rather than oppose it. This is what gatekeepers cannot survive, not opposition, not rebellion, proof that the gate is unnecessary, that what they control is accessible through other means. When Elvis succeeded on Milton Berle and Steve Allen, he proved that Ed Sullivan's rejection was just Ed Sullivan's opinion, not a barrier, not a requirement, just one man's preference that could be bypassed. And once bypass is possible, gates become optional, and optional gates are just doorways. And doorways don't need keepers, they just need to be open. Ed Sullivan continued hosting his show until 1971. 15 more years. He remained influential, important, but his influence had changed from mandatory to advisory, from gatekeeper to curator, from the person who decided what America could watch, to the person who showed America what America had already decided to watch. The distinction matters because one is power and the other is service, and you can't go backward from service to power. Once audiences realize they can choose, they keep choosing, and gatekeepers become historians, people who document what's happening, not people who control what happens. Ed Sullivan died in 1974. Obituaries called him a legend, the man who introduced America to Elvis, the Beatles, countless stars, but that framing was already nostalgic, already treating his role as presenter rather than controller. The system he'd built hadn't survived him, had stopped being his system years before he retired. Probably the moment Elvis Presley walked onto his stage and demonstrated that America's approval didn't require Ed's permission, that audiences could decide directly, that gates are just ceremonies, and ceremonies are optional. The final proof came decades later. When people remembered Ed Sullivan's show, they remembered who appeared on it: Elvis, the Beatles, the acts themselves. Ed became the venue, the stage, the context, not the reason. And being context is the opposite of being control. Context is where things happen, not why they happen. Ed Sullivan spent 8 years as a gatekeeper and 30+ years as a stage. And the transition from one to the other happened in September 1956, when he introduced someone he'd sworn to exclude, and discovered that exclusion only works until alternatives exist, and alternatives always exist. Eventually, have you ever watched someone maintain authority after everyone realized it was optional? That's not power, that's performance. And performances end when the audience stops believing. If this story made invisible systems visible, you should subscribe, because control is just agreement pretending to be necessity, and necessity dissolves the moment someone demonstrates it never was.